My presentation this morning will be primarily based on my book, Choose Wisely. It's called Practical Insights from Spiritual Traditions, but it is fundamentally about trying to find a way forward as people of conscience. How do we make wise decisions? What is the ground for our decisions? And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as 5 foundational principles that seem to be shared by the wisdom traditions of the world, whether those wisdom traditions are spiritually grounded or grounded in terms of secular human conscience. I'm not saying, by the way, that I think these are the 5 most important principles for wise decision making, or that these are the ones that are most commonly shared. I think there are many more than these 5. But what I want to do is provide some kind of model that makes sense to me based on my study and my reflection, so that hopefully others might be more conscious about the principles and values that are at the core or foundation of your life. So I'm not saying I'm presenting these for you to follow, but I am saying I'm presenting these as a way of hopefully helping you reflect on what are the core principles for your decision making. And would you be willing to make those more conscious, more intentional, more clear for yourself and in your dialogue with each other? The second thing that I've done here is identified not only 5 principles, but with each of those principles, 2 operating procedures for decision making and 2 criteria that you might apply in your decision making process. The reason why I do that is because I think a lot of people have said, well, here are the principles, but most models that I look at don't attempt to be clear or intentional about the decision-making process. How should our principles or values be engaged in the process of making wise decisions? So that's where I'm going. You got a little handout there that shows you exactly what I'm going to say, so you can all leave now. But those of you who want to stay, I'll talk a little bit more about these things. I'm also going to give you a bunch of other handouts, because my hope is that that this isn't the last time you're going to think about this stuff, and that you're actually, maybe over the course of the next few weeks, going to do some work on clarifying your own principles as people of conscience and reflecting on what are some of the critical decisions that each of us needs to make. We make, of course, lots and lots of decisions every day. Many of them are moral decisions. They have moral import. They have an effect, an impact on who we are as a community and what our relationships are. And so the kind of reflection that we need to do about our decisions is a daily affair. So the first principle that I find common across the wisdom traditions of the world, again, whether secular or sacred, is the principle that we ought to respect all persons. That we ought to, if you understand that word respect, if we go back to the root of that word, re spicere, it means actually to see each other, to recognize each other. And that means to listen to each other's stories, to understand each other's perspectives, to take account of each other's lives. That's a huge undertaking. But it seems to me it is absolutely critical to our being people of conscience. And again, you can look throughout the traditions of the world and find this foundational principle at the core of our decision-making process. In the Eastern traditions of the world, perhaps the most foundational principle is ahimsa, which is often talked about in terms of non-harming, but it's not just non-harming. That's the negative way of stating it, right? It is the principle of respect, the principle of valuing the life of not only all human creatures, but all sentient creatures. If you look at the Buddhist tradition, the bodhisattva takes a vow to help all other human beings become enlightened before they become enlightened. And that kind of deep regard for another human being, for all human beings, is again and again at the ground, at the foundation. This is why we find in every major religion of the world some version of the golden rule, some version of that, we ought to treat others in a way that we would want to be treated. Over cultures and countries and traditions, we find that foundational rule. Each person ought to be treated with respect. Now, in our present world, what would that mean for us if we really attempted to do that? Then what sorts of actions would we take? There's a wonderful website on what if we thought about the world as if it were just 100 people? Because it's hard for us to get our heads around, 7 billion people. But so if you think of the world in terms of 100 people. How many people would speak English? If the world were just 100 people, how many people would speak English? 30. About 5. About 5. How many people would speak Chinese? About 12, perhaps, 12 or 13. and 5 would speak Spanish, and 3 would speak Hindi, and 3 would speak Arabic, and 3 would speak Bengali, and 3 Portuguese, and a couple Russian, and a couple Japanese, and 62 would speak other languages in our world of 100 people. And how many people in a world of 100 people would not be able to read or write? About 17 would not be able to read or write. In a world of 100 people, how many people do you think would have a college degree? How many people in here have a college degree? So we are in the midst of a very privileged group, tremendously privileged group. About 7 out of our 100 people in the world would have a college degree. And in a room of 100, in a world of 100, one of us right now, just if the world were 100 people, would be dying of starvation. So what are we doing? How well are we doing on this respect for all persons? On seeing each other, valuing the lives of each other. I learned a little bit about this early on in my life from my grandpa, Boelhower, and I just want to read a poem about him. This is called Splinters of Lightning, and it helped me understand a little bit about what it might mean to really try to listen to another person's story. That's one way I like to think about people. Every person is a story, a unique story. And we don't really ever know the whole story of another person, even if we're intimately related to that individual. Splinters of Lightning. He didn't speak English, but he could do anything, it seemed to me, especially in his tar-papered tool shed with its dirt floor, so you were always standing on the earth. White, thick hair just long enough to stand straight and stiff, square jaw, eyebrows like tumbling whitecaps. He chased the children out of his plum tree with a hatchet, shouting at them in Dutch, the sharp blade gleaming. Every blade was sharp. Knife, axe, sickle, spade tip even, every blade honed to the perfect edge on his grinding stone. Nothing was more wondrous to me than the way he sharpened things. The perfect rhythm of the shuttle, the whir of the round stone, the sound of the two hard worlds, one grinding the other to a useful edge. The sparks flying off like splinters of lightning. Every few weeks, the blades would have to be set right again, a slow wearing away of their bodies so they could do their work. I can remember only one day when he wouldn't let me in, when I stood in the cold outside the shed, listening to the wheel turn, the terrible clash of hard worlds. It was in early January, and the day before we had taken our skates off their hooks in the attic, where they waited to cut a perfect arc in the ice. Why not let me in? to see the playful skates sharpened to their most graceful edge. He wouldn't answer me. But later, Mother told me, after he came to the New World, he had a daughter, his youngest child, born like a promise in America. And on Christmas Day, he gave her fine leather skates with shining blades, just like the ones he wore on the canals in the old country. But she never put her feet in them. She died on a cold, cold day in early January. And that story helped me see something about Grandpa Boelhower and the way he lived his life, his perspective. I learned, in fact, just a few months ago, through the internet, somebody from Holland reaching out over the waves to tell me that Grandpa Boelhower had lost 2 children before he came to America as well. How are we listening to each other's stories? Whose story haven't you heard that you would like to hear? Could you, in the next week or two, sit down with that person and ask something more about their story? If you notice on your sheet there, if we're going to make wise decisions, it seems to me, then we have to expand our listening process. We have to open it up. We have to invite intentionally diverse voices to the table of decision making. We need to do that in the Freethinkers, and we need to do that in every other aspect of our society. We have to bring in the voices that aren't being heard. We have to create seats at the table for the marginalized. And we have to constantly practice that most important life art of listening. Here's, I'm going to hand out another little handout here that might help you think about when you make wise decisions, who are you in conversation with? So in a sense, each of us has our own personal board of directors, right? People that we go to, people that we listen to, people whose voice we find valuable. So, this is a real simple activity. It's a roundish kind of table, oval table. And think about, and if you have a pen, write down, who are the people that sit on your personal board of directors? Who are the people that you regularly, or perhaps not so regularly, but they're still important to you in terms of their advice or their wisdom, their perspective that they bring to your life? Who would you put on that board of directors? And here are some other questions you might think about when you look at that board of directors. The people that you're bringing in to hear their voices, right? How many men, how many women are on your board of directors? How many people about your own age, within 7 or 8 years of your own age are on your board of directors? How many people 15 or 20 years younger than you are on your board of directors? Or 8 or 10 years older than you are on your board of directors? How many people on your board of directors have a significantly different spiritual or ethnic or racial or socioeconomic perspective? How diverse is your board of directors? And are there ways that you might begin to intentionally listen to voices that you haven't been listening to? Are there ways you might be able to reach out in our own community to listen to some voices that you haven't been taking into account as you make wise decisions in the world? Principle 1. Principle 2, appreciate the wholeness of being human. Already I'm well aware that I'm not going to get very far here in this process of really opening up these principles, but I'll mention them and I'll talk just a little tiny bit about them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to continue to reflect. So I think it's critically important to appreciate the wholeness of being human. And if we think about the greatest heroes and heroines, they're often people who have skills in many, many different areas. Renaissance people, sometimes we call them. People who have been able to, to do great physical feats as well as have tremendous intellectual acumen. People who are deeply feeling, who have big hearts, and at the same time have tremendous knowledge. The people that we often hold up are people who are whole, who have integrated lives. In other words, their lives are whole, they're authentic. The pieces of their lives go together, they match, they mesh. They aren't living one way in one aspect of their life and another way in another aspect of their life. They haven't significantly tried to create a gap or a difference between work life and personal life, so they're whole people. And I think one of the things that we need to do if we're going to make really wise decisions is we have to look at how can we be whole, and how in our decisions do we appreciate that wholeness of being human. More and more we're realizing that body and spirit, emotion and mind, that we're all of these things together. And more we're recognizing again that we can't just somehow cure the physical or look at physical symptoms without also often looking at the cultural reality, the family reality, the emotional reality of a person, that it all works together. One of the, I think, implications of this principle, to appreciate the wholeness of being human, is that when we make wise decisions, we should use all the ways of human knowing. And the human mind is one way of human knowing. But, there are as many receptors around the heart and the gut as there are here in the brain. So heart knowing and gut knowing are real ways of knowing. They're very real ways of knowing. If you listen to some of the greatest inventors and scientists, they'll talk about their gut level knowing, their intuitive knowing. A person, for instance, like Barbara McClintock, who was one of the greatest geneticists of all time, she studied corn, and she found the ways, some of the ways in which gene differences occur. And one of the problems with her getting any kind of recognition, at least while she was alive, was that she often talked about leaning into the corn and listening to the corn, because that's what she did. And she also had file cabinet after file cabinet full of minute observations of every corn plant she ever planted. So intuition and tremendous intellectual acumen. Sikorsky, the great inventor of the helicopter, he also designed airplanes. But the story is often told about one particular day that he was supposed to fly a new plane that he had designed, the prototype, the next day, and he walked around the airplane before he left the office, before he left the airfield, before the day that he was supposed to make that first flight, and he felt something was wrong, and he put a big note up saying that the test flight was canceled for the next day. And he couldn't intellectually say why, but it was very clear to him that something was wrong. And it was only a couple months later, he was in France and looking at another manufacturing airplane manufacturing facility, and there was an airplane out back that crashed, and it had the tail design exactly like the tail design that of the airplane that he was supposed to test fly. So how do you use your heart knowing? How do you use your intuition? How do you listen to your gut? On the important decision-making tables and boards that you're serving on, do you ask, when you're making important decisions, what are our values here? Not just, what's the data, but what are our values here? Or one of the things I've been doing lately is, when a meeting gets really heated and there's a lot of discussion going and people are starting to talk over each other, clearly people have strong points of view, I say, I'd like to have just 1 minute of silence. And we sit in silence for a minute. And everything changes. How much time are you spending in silence? Intentional silence. contemplation, listening to your own inner wisdom, to your own heart. Here's my next handout. So one way of looking at appreciating the wholeness of being human is to look at our primary responsibilities. We have lots of them, of course, but in this is a pie chart. So you might think about your 4 major responsibilities. Maybe you want to term them different than I have here. Growing my authentic self, cherishing important relationships, investing in meaningful work, participating in societal transformation. If you were to do your pie chart on the 4 most important responsibilities that you have, what would that pie chart look like? And if you do it in relationship to what is presently happening in your life, then you might do it again in terms of what would you like it to look like. We are constantly being called, aren't we? We are constantly being called into greater wholeness, into greater wisdom. Yes, yes. So the third principle that you have down there is to recognize the interconnectedness of all reality. Climate March is all about that, but there are all kinds of other ways in which I think we have to be systems thinkers. Systems thinkers. We have to look at the systems that we are a part of. We often look at individuals, and we often, blame individuals for things, but very often it's not the individual that is to be blamed or the individual that's to be thanked, actually. It's the system within which they are working. And I think we have to become much, much more sensitive to the systems. I was just backpacking in Isle Royal again, my 4th time on Isle Royal. And a few years ago, of course, Isle Royal is one of the natural research places trying to look at the relationship between wolves and moose. Most of the wolves have died out now, but they're probably going to be reintroducing them within the next couple of years. After over 50 years of study, one of the great researchers on this project said, well, gosh, we don't know very much. But a few years ago, this has been going on for over 50 years, trying to understand the relationship between predator and prey. And they've been measuring everything, the molars in the moose and the poundage and the antlers, and trying to look at all of the ways in which this relationship might be impacted. And just a few years ago, a new researcher joined the team, and she was just observing the moose at a particular location, and she realized that there was a lot of ticks hanging on this one moose. And ever since that time, part of the research now has been looking at tick loads on the moose as something that might have a significant effect or impact on their livelihood. So this very tiny, tiny creature might have a systemic role to play in that relationship between predator and prey. The indigenous peoples throughout the world very often talk about all my relations, that everything in the universe is a relationship, and we are related to it. How can we be more sensitive to the systems within our society, within our groups, our family, our schools? How do we begin to impact those systems? So I'll give you a little homework on systems thinking. And my last handout is going to look at these last two principles: to value inner wisdom, to value one's own values, personal experience. That means in the decision-making process to intentionally reflect on our experience deeply and broadly, to inquire with each other into our most important values, into our best practices, into the visions that we hold for the best that we can be as a human community. And at the same time, to both preserve the best of who we are, to preserve the values that are at the center of who we are, and to be bold in our decision-making, to practice radical creativity and innovation. We certainly need it. We're in dire straits right now in terms of the continuation of life as we know it, at least in the long run. For my great-grandchildren, the world probably will look quite different because of the climate changes that we're experiencing. So how can we, this question of bold action, creative, innovative steps to stay consistent with our foundational principles of the value of each other, the value of human life and all life. These are questions that we face. I'm going to give you a final handout that might take you weeks to do if you do it well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boelhower.
Yeah, thank you.